Welcome to session 18 of our class on understanding biblical literature. We are in slide number 36 of the PowerPoint presentation. And what we have here is a diagram that we need to be using when we do word studies. That is, we first start out with, again, choosing the words that we need to study from the passage, then determining what the word could mean, and then determining what the word does mean. And again, this is when this chart, this diagram, comes into play. So you start with your word, and then you look at the immediate context. Okay? The immediate context would be the verse that it is included in. Okay? And the verse above it and the verse below it. Maybe even the paragraph above it and the paragraph below it. Okay, that would be the immediate context. Then you would look at the context of the rest of the book in which your word is found. And then, once you have looked for any evidence in the same book, you need to move out to further context, and that is any other books written by the same author. Now, in this case, it would be like, with if we're looking at the Philippians 3:12 passage, then we would go to other writings by Paul. Okay, same author, other books. If you were studying a passage in Luke, then you would next look at the book of Acts. If you were studying a word in John, then you would also look at 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and maybe even Revelation. Okay? So, same author, other book. Then you would look at the rest of the New Testament. That is to say, other New Testament authors that have the same type of text or the same topic that is being covered by your word. Okay? And then you would go to the rest of the New Testament. Now, this all has to do with a New Testament word or New Testament passage. What you would do is you would add at least one other ring to this diagram if you were studying an Old Testament passage. So you would look at your word, you would look at the immediate context, you would look throughout the same book, you would look at the same author, other book or books. Then you would look at other Old Testament authors that have the same type of text or the same topic. Then you would look at the rest of the Old Testament. And then the last step would be to run your understanding of this word or topic through the rest of the New Testament. And the reason for this is because there are many passages in the New Testament that cover or either give the exact quotation of the passage you're working with, or they might have an allusion, to it, to your passage, and therefore you need to run your understanding of this word through in any comment that the New Testament might make on your passage. Okay? And We need to understand also that the closer the circle is to the middle, the more influence it's going to have on the meaning of your word. That is to say, the immediate context is going to have more influence, on the meaning of your word than the same book will. Okay? Now, one other thing that we need to throw in here is that you will rarely move beyond the same author circle, okay? Because generally you're going to get enough information from just these, these three circles beyond the middle to come to the meaning of the word in the context you're looking at. But if you have not been able to determine the meaning from these first three circles outside the middle one, then you would definitely go to the rest of them. Okay? Now, when we come to the idea of what the word does mean in the context, on slide number 37, there are some helpful questions that can be asked concerning the context. Okay, is there a contrast or a comparison that seems to define the word? For example, when you come to Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 4, you will see that the text says, let me just go over there real quick and quote it, read it from the text. In verse 4, it says, marriage is to be held in honor among all, and the marriage bed is to be undefiled. For fornicators and adulterers, God will judge. Okay? Now, it's not necessarily in this context that you have a contrast or a comparison that seems to define the word that we're looking at, and that would be the word undefiled. But there is a comparison going on when you find other instances of this word in the rest of the New Testament. And that is to say that the word undefiled, this same word that is used here, is used elsewhere. In this case, it's used of the sexual relationship in marriage, because it says marriage is to be held in honor among all, and the marriage bed, or literally just the bed, okay, it's the word, the Greek word is koite, from which we get our word coitus, and therefore it has to do with the sex act within marriage, okay? Now, within marriage, the sex act between a man and his wife is undefiled. It's to be held in an understanding of it's not defiled, okay? Well, there are at least two other uses of this same word, undefiled, in the rest of the New Testament. And again, you would have to go outside the book of Hebrews, okay, in order to get this. But, again, you would at least get to that point if you if you had not determined the meaning by now, okay, or by just looking at the context. Actually, it's used in Hebrews twice, in James once, and in 1 Peter one time. It's only used 4 times in the New Testament. So let's see if we can find those 4 times. It's used in our passage here in Hebrews 13:4. In James, it is used of religion, the word religion. It's James 1:27. It's used, it says, pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself unstained from unstained by the world. Okay, so undefiled religion, untainted religion is to take care of orphans and widows in their time of need and to keep oneself unspotted or unstained by the world. Now, another use is 1 Peter chapter 1:4. And in this case, it speaks of an inheritance which is imperishable and undefiled and will not fade away, reserved in heaven for you. So in this case, the word undefiled speaks of the inheritance that we are going to receive in heaven. Okay? That is heaven itself, being with God for eternity. And then finally, in Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 26, it is used of Christ himself, where it says, for it was fitting for us to have such a high priest, holy, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens, who does not need daily to, like those high priests, to offer up sacrifices, first for his own sins, and then for the sins of the people, because this he did once for all when he offered up himself. Okay? So in this case, the word undefiled is used of Christ. So when you try to get an understanding of what this word undefiled means, unstained, untainted, it's not dirty, okay? When you compare the 3 other things that, or when you see the 3 other things that are described with this word undefiled, it gives you an idea of exactly what it's talking about. That is to say, when it talks about, again in James 1:27, it talks about pure religion, of taking care of orphans and widows and keeping ourselves unstained from the world. It's used in 1 Peter 1:4 of heaven itself. And it's used in Hebrews 7:26 of Christ, who is now our high priest, for the faithful Christian. So when you look at the marriage bed, the sex act, it is held in such a way that it's on a plane with, it's on a level with the purity of heaven, the purity of Christ, and the purity of religion that is practiced before God according to his will. So how pure is sex within marriage? It's just as pure as Christ is, who had no sin, who never once tainted himself with the sin of the world. It's as pure as heaven itself, where God dwells. And it's as pure as let's see. Well, I can't remember what I've covered. So in James 1:27, it's pure religion. In 1 Peter 1:4, it's heaven, and in Hebrews 7:26, it is Christ. So sex is as pure as these things within marriage. So this will help you to understand just exactly what it means to be undefiled. Okay? Unstained, untainted, pure. Okay? Next, the next question we need to understand or ask when we're determining our meaning of the meaning of our word in context is, does the subject matter or topic of the passage dictate a word meaning? Okay. Again, just using our example from earlier, the idea of a spring. Okay. If you were to dismantle a rifle or a handgun, then you would run across a spring, okay? Unless, you would run across a spring. So if I were to say, when I broke down my rifle to clean it, I took out the spring, okay? So what would you think that would be in the context? Well, in the context would demand that it means a metal coil, okay? So that's another example of what we're talking about here. And then finally, does the author's usage of the same word elsewhere in a similar context help you decide which meaning best fits the word? Okay? Again, when you look at the usage in Hebrews 7:26 and the usage in Hebrews 13:4 of our word undefiled, then you will understand, in Hebrews 7 it's used of Christ, and in Hebrews 13 it's used of the sex act within marriage. So the author uses the same word in a similar context to help you understand what the word undefiled has to do with. All right. Other helpful questions is, does the author's argument in the book suggest a meaning? Sometimes more than one sense is possible, but we must choose the one sense that fits the context. So is there anything within the book, within the argument that the author is trying to make, that will help us? And also, does the historical situation tilt the evidence in a certain direction? These are all good questions to ask. So, when we go back to Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, in our example, in slide number 39, it says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice," etc., etc. So we choose the word offer here because it is crucial to our understanding of the passage. And if we better understand this verb, then we will know how to better react to God's action in our life. Before advancing, I want you to look up the word offer in your concordance and see what the semantic range is. Okay? Hope you've done that, because I'm going to go on to the next slide now. When you go to the concordance, you will find that it is used, this word offer, it is used 6 other times in Romans, okay? and it happens to be the same Greek word, 42:25. It's used once in 1 Corinthians, and it's a different Greek word, 5502. And then it's used 3, 7, 8 times in Hebrews, most of which is word number 4712, but one of which, or two of which, are number 429. And then finally, in Revelation 8, it is used, the number 1443 is used. So you've actually got only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words to deal with here, 5 Greek words. Well, all of these are not going to help us except for, that is, these other words are not going to help us because we're just looking at Romans 12:1, which happens to be the same word, happens to be used in the rest of Romans. So you will look at also Romans 6:13, the context there, Romans 6:16, and Romans 6:19, which happens to be all in the same chapter. So the idea of offering will be helped greatly. The meaning of this word will be helped greatly by looking at all of the context usage in Romans. Now, when we go to 42:25 in the back of the concordance, where you go to the Greek dictionary, number 4225, you will find that it is the word paristemi, okay? And this is the root word. Paristemi is made up of 2 words, 4123 and 2705. 4123 is the preposition para, and 2705 would be the word histemi. Okay? Now, the range of meanings, the semantic range, would be to place beside, to put at disposal, to present, to make an offering, to stand before, to provide, to come to aid. Now, the NIV translates this word, present, as 7 times, offer 6 times, standing near 5 times, stood beside 2 times, and then several different ones that are used only 1 time. Now, so you have your semantic range, and you also have the different uses or the different translations that the NIV gives of the same word. Okay, so we have found all of the places that it's used. We have found the Greek definition or the Greek word in the Greek concordance. We have looked at all the semantic range, that is to say, it is in slide number 42, to make available, to put at someone's disposal, to provide, to arrive, to come, to stand by, to be present, to present someone to someone. Now, in slide number 43, we have other parts of the semantic range: to stand against, to appear as an enemy, to prove or demonstrate, to appear before a judge, to help, to bring close or near. So then in slide 44, we have to look at this whole semantic range, and then we have to decide what the word does mean in the context in which we find it. So they've already done the work for us. It is to make available, to put at someone's disposal, to provide, or to present someone to someone. So the context suggests 2 possible meanings. And in order to choose between these 2 options, which are very similar, we should focus on the occurrence of this word elsewhere in Romans. So we go to Romans chapter 6, as I suggested before, and it says, "Do not offer any part of yourself to sin as an instrument of wickedness, but rather offer yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and offer every part of yourself to Him as an instrument of righteousness." Then in slide 46, you have verse 16 of Romans 6. "Don't you know that when you offer yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one who you obey, whether you are slaves to sin, which leads to death, or to obedience, which leads to righteousness." And then the last time it's used is in Romans 6, verse 19, where he says, "I'm using an example from everyday life because of your human limitations. Just as you used to offer yourselves as slaves to impurity and to ever-increasing wickedness, so now offer yourselves as slaves to righteousness, leading to holiness." So therefore, we have these usages. Now, you also have the usage of the word parahistemi, okay, or paristemi, sorry, in Romans 14:10. Okay. In this case, you then, why do you judge your brother or sister, or why do you treat them with contempt? For we will all stand before God's judgment seat. So in this case, it is translated stand before. And then finally, you have the word paristemi is used in Romans 16:2, and it says, "I ask you to receive her in the Lord in a way worthy of His people, and to give her any help she may need from you, for she has been the benefactor of many people, including me." So, the idea here is the idea of helping. Okay, so actually, when we look at the context, we simply do not find in Romans 16 and Romans 14, we don't find any help to help us in our context in Romans 12, because the word help doesn't necessarily fit our context, and the word stand by or stand before doesn't help our context. So if you come to slide 50, you will find that the best one that fits the context is to present someone to someone. That is, we present our bodies a living sacrifice. We offer our bodies as a living sacrifice. Okay, now again, you would have to do more study on living sacrifice to figure out just exactly what's going on. But the idea is that the usages in chapter 6 and chapter 12, the parallels between these passages where this word is used, the parallels are strong. And in both instances, people are giving their bodies to the service of some power. Now, since body probably refers to the whole person, and not just the physical body, then we choose to present someone to someone. Okay? So this is how we would go about a word study. All right, that brings us to the end of chapter 9. We'll still have about 30 minutes left in this session, so let's switch over to chapter 10. And let's do that real quick, or as quick as we can here. All right. Chapter 10 is entitled Who Controls Meaning? And, you know, who controls the meaning of a text? There are actually two possibilities. Slide number 3 is one where authorial intent is a possibility. This approach assumes that the author determines the meaning of a text, and you know, that's one possibility of understanding here. You know, do whatever text we might be looking at. Okay. One possible way of understanding who controls the meaning is to understand that the author controls the meaning. The second possibility is found in slide 4, and that is reader response. Okay, this approach argues that meaning is determined by the reader or a community of readers. Now, when we look at authorial intent in slide number 5, again, this views a text as communication between the author and the reader. And the question that would be asked with this understanding, with this way of determining who controls meaning, or again, it's really, the idea is how we look at the text. Do we look at it as if the author is trying to tell us something, or in the case of the Bible, his original readers something, or do we look at the text as if we get to determine the meaning of the text, no matter what the author meant? And that's reader response. But for now, we're looking at the definition of authorial intent. Again, it views a text as communication between the author and the reader. And the question we ask when we look at a text this way is, what does the author mean? Better yet, we would say, what did the author mean to get across to his original audience? Because again, we start with the first step of the interpretive journey, which would be grasping the text in their town. Okay? But when you go to reader response in slide 6, again, it does not view a text as communication between the author and the reader. And the question that one would ask if they approach the text with a reader response idea is, what does this mean to me? And again, the reader gets to put any meaning they want to on the text. Again, whether it's the Bible or anything else. Okay? This is the way reader response works. So, the fact is that in slide number 7, one of our foundational beliefs is that the Bible is the Word of God. Therefore, we read the Bible seeking the author's intent. We do not, or we should not, read the Bible with the idea of just asking the question, well, what does this mean to me? Okay? See, that's part of the danger, or it's part of the problem with religion today, is because many people go to the text of the Bible and say, well, this passage means this to me. Now, it might mean something different to you, and that's okay. Whatever meaning you get out of it, that's what God is wanting you to do. Whatever meaning I get out of it is what God is wanting me to do. And that's just not the way that we should do our study of the Bible. Because the Bible claims to be the Word of God. And it claims to tell us that, there is a heaven and there is a hell. It claims to tell us that there is right and there is wrong, that there is righteousness and then there is sin, okay? And it claims to tell us that if we follow the things found there concerning God and His plan to bring man back into fellowship with Him, then the Bible claims to be the way to heaven. Okay? Well, again, if you believe that the Bible is the Word of God, and then you're going to read it seeking what the author's intent was. And again, the main author of the Bible is God Himself, the Holy Spirit. So therefore, what He has written to us through the human authors is what we should seek to understand. And this is what the interpretive journey is all about. You go back to what does the text mean in their town. You cross you measure the width of the river across. What are the differences between us and them? Then you cross the principalizing bridge, coming up with a principle that fits with all of the Bible, which you find out when you consult the biblical map. And then finally, you apply the theological principle to the situation that you're in, or that we find humanity in our time. So, this class teaches, this book teaches, and I believe wholeheartedly that we need to look at the Bible seeking the author's intent. Next, following that idea, in slide 8, we do not create the meaning. Okay? We do not get to put our meaning on the text. Rather, we seek to discover the meaning that has been placed there by the author. Now, again, let's define author, which we've done just a minute ago, but let's do it again here on slide number 9. When we use this term in conjunction with the Bible, we are referring to both the human author and the divine author, realizing that the divine author is the one who controls all of it. Okay? There is there's no question about that if we believe that the Bible is inspired, that it is from God. Okay? And we gave you enough evidence to look over in our understanding or our covering of the topic of inspiration in earlier videos. Next, let's look at the definition of the word meaning in slide number 10. When we use this term, we're referring to that which the author wishes to convey with his signs. Now, the word signs is defined in your textbook as, words, grammar, and, syntax, and so forth when it comes to the way words are put together. All right? So the signs that an author uses are those, in order to get his message across. Now, when we talk about application in slide number 11, when we use this term, we're referring to our response as the reader to the meaning of the text. All right? So, author is God working through humans. Meaning is what the author intended to get across to his original readers. And then application is having gone through the other interpretive steps and to apply the meaning of the text to our lives today. Okay? Our response as the reader to the meaning of the text is application. And then in slide number 12, he gives a little bit more information, a little bit more detail concerning the map or the diagram, I guess, the picture that he gave near the beginning of the book concerning the interpretive journey. That is in slide number 1, or in step number 1, sorry, this is slide number 12. In step number 1, this is where meaning is discovered. Also in step 3 and step 4. So in steps 1, 2, 3, and 4, meaning is discovered. The only reason it doesn't have an arrow pointing to number 2 is because it is simply a step marking out the differences and the similarities between the first readers and us. Okay? But that's included in the steps to determine meaning. And then finally, step number 5 is where application is lived. Okay? So this is extremely important to understand. When you are in your exercises, when you're going through steps 1, 2, 3, and 4, you are not trying to interpret at that point. Okay? Or that is to say, I'm sorry, in steps 1 and 2, you're not trying to interpret. It's in steps 3 and 4 where you begin to interpret and come to your theological principle and apply it or compare it to the rest of the biblical map. And then in step 5, you apply what you have learned. Okay. Now, when we talk about determining what the author meant, we need to keep in mind that language has limitations. Okay? Language has limitations. Now, when we talked about signs that the author uses in slide number 14, it says the biblical writers used grammar, syntax, word meanings, literary context, historical context, and a host of literary devices to communicate God's message to us. Okay? That is to say, they used grammar, syntax, and word meanings and literary devices such as irony and chiasm and the other things that we've talked about, typology and analogy and so forth. But the literary context also would figure into that, as far as what type of context they used, what genre did they use. And finally, the historical context is not so much what the biblical writer used, but it's where in time that setting, the setting of that writing was found. Okay, that is to say, what historical cultural context did the writer write into, okay, and write to. All right. There are two types of theological truths. They are general, universal truths and context-specific truths. What do we mean by that? Well, let's go to slide number 16. And let's look at, from the left side at the bottom of this diagram. In the Old Testament context, the specific in Leviticus chapter 11, when it comes to holiness, is that holiness involves avoiding unclean food. That's just one of the things that is involved in holiness, okay? And in this case, he's just picking out one specific thing that is involved in holiness, and that is don't eat pork, okay? Cannot eat pigs under the Old Testament, okay? And then next, in the Old Testament law, God instructs the Israelites that in all aspects of life, they must life must be lived in terms of separation. That is, the clean and the unclean, so that they will always be conscious of God's holy presence. And this even includes what they eat. And then we understand that in the Old Testament, holiness involves separating righteousness from sinfulness and clean from unclean. So when that comes down again to the bottom left, it manifests itself, it is applied in don't eat pork. And again, there are several other things there, and I think it's Leviticus chapter 11 all the way through chapter 16 or 17, that many things are given that you will do these things if you intend to remain holy. Okay. Well, the top of the diagram says God is holy, and He wants His people to be holy. That would be the theological principle that is true of both Old and New Testaments. So let's work our way down on the right side and say, in the New Testament, holiness involves separating righteousness from sinfulness, clean from unclean, just like it was in the Old Testament. But in the New Testament, Jesus explains that clean and unclean is no longer based on what one eats, but it's based on what one does and says. In fact, in that context, I believe it is, if it's not in Matthew 15, it's in another passage where it says that when He said this, He declared all foods clean. Okay? So if you want to be a New Testament Christian, you do not have to ban eating of pork in your life. All right? You can eat pork, because Jesus has considered it, has declared it clean, all foods. Now, let's get down to some specifics of what it means to be holy. In the New Testament, the New Testament context specific, the one is being used is 1 Peter 1, 13 to 22. And in this context, holiness involves one's manner of living. Very specific is be self-controlled, be obedient to the truth, and love one another. So the definition of the specifics of holiness are totally different than they were in the Old Testament. But the principle is the same. God is holy, and He wants His people to be holy. This is what we mean by the general universal truth, which would be at the top of the diagram, and the context-specific truth that is at the bottom of each side, on the right and the left. Now, when we talk about the journey of determining meaning, who determines the meaning. We have said God determines the meaning through his human authors. But as to the question of purpose, we identify the meaning in step 1, and as we do that, we must determine the purpose of the truth that we discover. Okay? Now, this again goes to the theological principle that we need to find in order to apply it to our lives. Now, some complementary guidelines for the interpretive journey. As part of step 1, we need to identify where our passage fits within the large overarching story of the Bible. Okay? Again, the idea of coming up with a theological principle that fits the overarching accounts of the Scriptures. As you move from step 1 to steps 2 and 3, you will be able to identify the purpose of the passage. Okay? Especially when you get to step 3, you will be working on the theological principle. Next, you use the purpose in slide number 20. You use the purpose to move from the context-specific meaning to the more general theological truths from that passage. Excuse me. And, this is where we, again, move to the theological principle. And finally, you select, in slide 21, you select the theological principle that is as specific as possible while still general enough to apply to us as New Testament believers. Again, the idea being that if you're looking at an Old Testament passage, you would take all that and run it through the New Testament, and then what the New Testament says is what would determine how it applies to us. Okay? If it's a New Testament passage, then you don't have that extra step of that you have with the Old Testament. All right? So when it comes to determining meaning and who controls meaning, God controls the meaning, and we must go through the steps of the interpretive journey to get to that meaning. All right. That takes us through chapter 10. It's very short. So we will stop here and begin chapter 11 in our next session.